entrepreneurship has become essential because it's the fastest and most reliable way to turn uncertainty into actionable knowledge. And that applies whether you're launching a tech startup or even if you're running a country. But you might be wondering why exactly has entrepreneurship become so critical today? Well, entrepreneurship is fundamentally about finding new ways to deliver value, and that applies through the creation of new products or services, or even just finding new business models. So today, the environment is changing a lot. Consumer preferences, technology, even markets are changing faster than ever. So organizations that don't continuously adapt risk really becoming irrelevant. I am talking about organizations for a reason. We often think about entrepreneurship and we think about startups, but the concept is much, much broader. Entrepreneurship, the way I see it at least, is a mindset. It can really transform small businesses, family run companies, large corporations, and even governments. What sets entrepreneurial organization apart is that they're willing to experiment quickly under uncertainty and they can test ideas rapidly rather than relying on slow and bureaucratic decision-making processes. You might be wondering about what are some examples, and there are many that come to mind. I think Dropbox is a great one. When the company started, they didn't have a fully functioning software, but they decided to focus on testing demand through a video that showed what the software would do when ready. The video worked so well that it convinced thousands of users to sign up to Dropbox newsletter pretty much overnight. So this agile approach enabled the company to very quickly test market demand before they invested in traditional and much, much slower development processes. But as I said earlier, I think it's important to realize that entrepreneurship is not just about the private sector. For instance, let's consider what the UAE government is doing. They are really applying entrepreneurial methods to public policy. Initiatives like Dubai's Smart City programs and the UAE's ambitious space missions rely on systematic experimentation. Successful entrepreneurial ecosystems do not emerge out of the blue. In fact, they usually follow a very clear pattern with three distinct phases. At first, entrepreneurial ecosystems start with individuals experimenting. So early entrepreneurs might test new ideas independently, they quickly iterate, and they find new solutions and market opportunities. Second, the ecosystem evolves towards more structured collaborative learning. So this happens usually as entrepreneurs, but also investors and mentors, they gather to systematically share insights. And this includes failure too. This usually happens in spaces like accelerators, incubators, and a bunch of other institutions. Finally, the ecosystem reaches a stage of institutional adoption where entrepreneurial methods become really integrated into established organizations as well as government structures. At this stage, even the traditional institutions usually embrace agile and experimental methods, so they transform their internal practices to really sustain innovation. Singapore is a great example of how entrepreneurial ecosystems evolve, and in fact, Singapore evolved in a very short amount of time. In the beginning, there were individual innovators, and then later, Singapore's entrepreneurial environment institutionalized agile startup methodologies. Today, Singaporean government agencies support venture building, they run innovation labs, and they're using entrepreneurial techniques to improve public service delivery, but also to generate new market opportunities. They've moved from being just regulators to active participants and facilitators of innovation. In fact, they've become a platform for entrepreneurial experimentation. But I think it's very important to note, and that's where building ecosystems is hard, that there is no one-size-fits-all formula. Entrepreneurial ecosystems must find their unique paths, and they need to consider their distinctive local characteristics, even turning what looks like a constraint into a competitive strength. Another example in Asia is Indonesia that really shows this strategy. Rather than perceiving its fragmented and multi-island geography as an issue, Indonesian entrepreneurs and policymakers recognize it as an opportunity. They developed specialized logistic and fintech solutions that were really tailored to the complex geography that they have. Probably the first company you think about when you think about Indonesia is Gojek. And Gojek didn't just replicate Uber's model. Instead, what it did is that it started by thinking about what solutions would work here, and it ended up building a super app approach, which was really uniquely tailored to Indonesian consumer needs across multiple islands. In the end, Gojek offers so many services ranging from transportation to financial payment, And beyond that, Gojek has really created an ecosystem that has created more and more entrepreneurship building on its services. They simplify business registration processes, but they also provide targeted and ideally evidence-based support mechanisms. So their impact can really influence entrepreneurial success. However, as you're saying, there is a very delicate balance. If you want to provide effective support, you also don't want to stifle the innovation that you're really trying to promote. I've collaborated closely with various government agencies and government departments, and what I've realized that is really critical is that the most effective role in entrepreneurship is not to be a traditional rule maker, but instead is to be a provider of a platforms for experimentation. This approach involves that governments are adopting entrepreneurial methods themselves, a practice that is called regulatory experimentation. So instead of relying just on traditional and top-down rulemaking, regulatory experimentation means that governments are creating sandbox-like environments where entrepreneurs can test new ideas, new products, and new services. For example, in Hong Kong, a few years ago, the government offered licenses to few digital banks, and that was a very controlled environment for few players to experiment and try to develop something new in the fintech space. In a very similar way, the UAE government has embraced this mindset across multiple initiatives, from testing self-driving vehicles in a very controlled environment to piloting new visa categories for entrepreneurs. And what the government does is that it's really measuring the impact before they fully implement. This approach is very important because it avoids the pitfalls of trying to choose winners, trying to predict outcomes in markets that change way too quickly. And what we realize is that even the most informed regulators, they really struggle to decide ahead of time who will win in these environments. Instead, the idea here is to transform regulation from a barrier into a dynamic learning process that will evolve as innovation evolves as well. The reality is that many emerging ecosystems face the challenge that I'm, for instance, currently seeing in Pakistan, where the VC ecosystem is growing, but not at a pace that is sufficient to meet entrepreneurial demand for capital. So this creates an opportunity, if you think about it, to develop alternative financing models that may actually be more sustainable for local conditions. If you think about it, VCs focus usually on high growth, exit driven investments, but these alternative finance models can prioritize sustainable money and knowledge sharing where it matters most for ecosystem development. Let me give you some examples here. Revenue based financing allows entrepreneurs to access capital without giving up equity or committing to quick growth that may not really align with local market realities. Government-backed loans are another example, so there can be guarantee schemes that reduce risk for traditional lenders, making them more willing to support these early-stage companies. Peer-to-peer lending platforms can be another interesting alternative to mobilize local capital that might otherwise remain unused. And a lot of us don't think about family businesses, but family businesses are everywhere and they can offer patient capital combined with a lot of market knowledge and networks, creating long-term partnerships that prioritize sustainable growth over quick exits. What's very valuable about these alternative models is that they focus more on knowledge transfer and not just purely providing capital. So these creative approaches recognize that building a growing ecosystem is more about creating sustainable systems that work, given the economic and the cultural context. And that doesn't mean that you cannot build the sophistication needed later for more traditional investments, but they really take into account what the local context needs first. Success requires a clear vision for what the ecosystem development should look like based on the country's specific context and constraint. So this approach should really align with what are the local fundamental realities. Is this a small country that needs a global orientation from day one? Or is this a large market where we should focus locally first and then grow outside? I think that this distinction is really crucial because it shapes everything that the government or other entities can do to support a local ecosystem. So this would mean what are the type of startups that we want to support and what are the skills that we want to develop within the ecosystem. The UAE shows how a small economy global first approach can really work. The UAE has a relatively small domestic market. We're talking about roughly 10 million people between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And so this country had to really position itself as a regional hub from the start. It leverages its geographic position, which is conveniently located between Asia, Africa, and Europe, and it's combined with very business-friendly regulation so that it has become the Middle East startup gateway. Just next door, Saudi Arabia is following a very different model. The domestic market is much larger with 35 million people, and there is substantial wealth, which means that they're focusing initially on solving local challenges, but they're really building towards regional and possibly global leadership. Their Vision 2030 strategy is an interesting example because it shows you how intentional the government can be in targeting sectors like fintech and logistics, where local solutions can really scale outside of the kingdom as well. Pakistan is a very different example. This is a large market, and there is a lot of potential to start locally first. They have over 240 million people, and so the domestic opportunity is huge, but the ecosystem is still developing. And so the infrastructure and the financing models needed to fully capitalize on this scale still need to be built so that entrepreneurs can build domestic capabilities first while they really develop the global orientation needed so that they can grow outside of the country as well. I think in general, the advantage comes from aligning your ecosystem development strategy with your natural constraints and opportunities, rather than trying to study and understand models that worked elsewhere but that are unlikely to work in another country with very different characteristics. What we've seen is that the countries that succeed are the ones that are intentional about whether they're building for global reach, domestic scale, or regional leadership. And then they design, then support systems accordingly.